I worry to your point about the linearity of this. Does it sort of slow down next year um, before the 800 volt data center really takes off, and then we see a re-acceleration again in 28? It's going to be a job to keep track of all this.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of The Circuit. I am Ben Bajarin.
Greetings, programs. I'm Jay Goldberg.
All right, we've got a range of things to talk today. Let's start with analog devices. Our sort of, what do we say, quarterly check-in with the analog industry. Sometimes there's
If
pockets of
if
optimism.
that.
Sometimes, yeah, people freak out. But anyway, they had a good quarter. Obviously, we've talked about there will be a pretty consistent analog cycle pull in, particularly around data center power and others. But we've noted it's been kind of lumpy, I guess. But I'll let you start on the signals from earnings.
So the big sort of event that took place at Analog Devices, they reported earnings this week, and industrial and consumer and all that stuff they usually do is doing well, which is important. But the most important stuff is they laid out a clear case for their opportunity in AI. And the analog companies have not participated to the same degree as memory and digital logic companies have, but analog is starting to become more important in the data center. We're using so much electricity, you start to need a whole new category of electrical systems, and that's we're finally we've seen this for a while now because people have been talking about the 800 volt data center. It's
Yep.
companies like TI and On and Navitas and Wolfspeed, right? And ADI has been kind of quiet about it. And this quarter they came out and they laid out, they said, hey, this is what we think our addressable market is. And we're seeing data center is about 10% of their revenue now. It doubled in the quarter, and they think it's going to double this year and double again next year. And so they're now, they're joining the party. Uh, so interesting, just that ADI is sort of the last to sort of talk about it. They're probably the most conservative management team in the space. But also interesting was they sort of scoped out the market for analog, which I don't think anyone else has really done yet. It was pretty it was interesting. They shared a lot of information,
It
right?
was
And
interesting.
most go ahead.
Go ahead. No, I was gonna say it was interesting the talk on margins where they. I don't know if they're they are pretty high. I mean, others have slightly lower margins, which I heard, and I was trying to listen to some of the investor questions also. I think which was poking at the idea of they others having a little bit more pricing leverage to use if they're going to hold at lower gross margins, since I think they're signaling 70, it was 74% and that can hold. But yeah, the margins I think was interesting, which again is just an absurd conversation when you look historically at analog margins, but so be it.
All right. So on the margin side, I think analog devices and TI tend to have higher margins than analog overall,
Yeah,
um,
right.
because they tend to sell directly to customers. Much of the rest of the analog space sells through the channel where there's less, you're sort of competing on price much more heavily. I think there is this weird thing though where you have a lot of these traditional long-standing companies that are now joining AI, and sometimes the questions they get on the questions they get on the calls show people just trying to figure that out and just trying to like use the old framework for analyzing these companies in this very new way, in this very new
Sure.
market. And so there's a little bit of disconnect. I think their margins there are, uh, I think that's a secondary story. I think what was like, they're going to do fine. Like the whole 800 volt data center story for analog is you're going to replace a bunch of sort of lower value parts, not quite commodity, but almost commodity parts with some very, very high spec parts, right? That's what 800 volt data center is. Your big transition, in addition to just being large quantities of these chips now. Um,
Right.
and so this the story the long term story for analog parts in data center is this idea of we're selling a lot of high priced parts, which is good news for them.
Yeah.
I think to me the really standout feature is they said we think they quantified how much analog content goes into a data center, and they said it's a
Right.
billion to
Right.
$1.5 billion of analog content per gigawatt, right? And so we have NVIDIA saying 50 going to 100 billion per gigawatt to build a data center, and what's that? 2% of that goes to analog, which is small compared to NVIDIA, but is very meaningful for companies like AI and TI. It'd be ADI and TI. Um, I I also I really appreciated this. They didn't talk about TAM, total addressable market. They kept referring to their SAM, their serviceable addressable market, right? And that the difference being TAM is like everything that goes into the space. SAM
Right.
is
Right.
everything that they can sell into,
Right.
right? And so you may not have a part you can sell into the TAM, but but the SAM is what you actually can sell into. And I think the knock on ADI up until now has been their SAM is relatively small in the data center. And I think they thought that too. What they said on the call was over the last few months, they've sort of did a deep analysis of the market and they realized their SAM was double what they thought it was. They also have an acquisition in there that brings them deeper into it. And so I just like everybody throws out these big TAM numbers, and the ADI, again, conservative management team, a lot like AMD, but ADI's management team threw out the SAM because look, they're implicitly saying like, hey, we could throw out these big crazy numbers too, but we're just going to talk about what we can actually address. And it's bigger than I think it's bigger than they thought. So it was good news for them.
Yep. SAMs are with the way to go for those companies who are listening. SAM is a better number than TAM. So we always get this question in market models and data, which is like, what's the real market opportunity? Not how much is, it's nice to say CapEx is going to be $10 trillion, but what are you actually selling into? It's a much smaller pie. Let's not mislead people, but I get it. Yeah, and I know, and I think again, right? We did a power report a couple months ago, just looking at the sheer pull of attach to power as all these data center racks get bigger and pull more power, but also just like you said, 800 VDC, the transition that's going on in just serving power from grid to facility. There's a lot of analog in there. And it was interesting too. I don't remember if I said this, so sorry if I'm repeating everybody, but there's a real interesting way that kind of these analog play in 800 VDC for safety. So like when somebody is detaching a rack, um, so that circuits can actually be managed and shut off accordingly. And so there's a whole like a whole new sort of path on what it's looking like for these very specific applications and serviceability and safety also, um, as the entirety of a cluster and whatnot starts to pull far more energy. So yeah, I mean, I think the content opportunity is big. It's good ADI put a little bit of numbers on that. But yeah, analog is gonna be a beneficiary.
Yeah, right. And I think for ADI the the story had the my assumption had been that they really served the from the edge of the data center where the utility connection where the power comes in, or from the if you're doing behind the meter or whatever, where the electricity comes in to the wall of the data center itself, right? And um, and then it turns out they actually had content inside the data center. And now
Yeah.
what they're saying is they bought this company called Empower that actually brings them actually to the package level. You get the sub volt conversion stuff. And right, and they talked about optical too, because everybody loves optical, and they seem pretty excited about their optical opportunity. And again, they're not sitting next to the transceivers and the lasers, which is I think where the biggest volume is. They're on the control path, so timers and power management and telemetry kind of stuff, which is again not the massive opportunity, but still meaningful for them,
Yeah.
and leaves the door
I
open
mean,
for
I
them to
think,
do another acquisition.
yeah, I think what's interesting about this, like, there's been, they aren't the only example. There's a handful of others, kind of in this space, but I would also again say in things like FPGAs, like my report last week around FPGAs and talking with Lattice management, even just stuff conversations with Infineon and TI. Like, it's interesting that they are sometimes hearing about new opportunities they didn't know about as customers are going deep in the weeds trying to solve engineering problems for compute racks or for power or for liquid cooling, right? And so I just think it's interesting that they'll be like, oh, we just heard of this new application that, we didn't know we solved for X, Y, whatever. And I say all of that to say we're in such this moment where, like, there's a lot of engineering challenges kind of across the board, and it's creating interesting opportunities that are somewhat sometimes unpredictable by some of these vendors, because they're being used in a unique way that perhaps they didn't slot for or design for, because an engineer's like, oh, I could use a PMIC for this, or I can use a analog sensor for this. So I think that's just interesting in, call it this kind of very technical engineer's dream to solve some very hairy problems in building complex data centers and compute and all of that stuff.
Yeah, I mean, for me, the really interesting thing is you're seeing the analog companies' data center revenue really running, like both TI and ADI are doubling their data center revenue. And that's before we get to 800-volt data center, right? Nobody's really building an 800-volt data center today. It's all prototyping, right? It's just the design decisions are getting made today to solve those technical problems. The real build out for
Right.
800-volt data center isn't until 2028. And we're already seeing these
Yeah.
companies' data center numbers run. Um, I worry, to your point about the linearity of this. Does it sort of slow down next year, um, before the 800-volt data center really takes off, and then we see a reacceleration again in 28? Uh, it's a it's gonna be a job to keep track of all this.
This is why I go to all these conferences and I stick my head in these compute racks so I can look at when I send you all these pictures of microcontrollers and PMICs and analog sensors and capacitors, because I'm like, look how many there are now. But you're absolutely right. It is anyway, I just love the engineering moment that we're in, that people are trying to solve new problems with existing technology, being super creative about it. And I just, again, it's interesting that it's a little bit more unpredictable. Like, some of it's predictable, but then some of it's like, well, how are you going to solve that problem? Well, I'm not sure. And engineers are just being creative, and some company can all of a sudden benefit from that they didn't see coming. So I think that's interesting. That was the only point I wanted to make on that. All right. So apparently, a AI has solved cancer, or cancer has been solved. There's now a vaccine, so I don't have to keep going down to the guy down by the river who keeps offering me the cancer vaccine for $20 a shot. Right? I'm just kidding. It's always my joke. I'm like, yeah, I just got the cancer vaccine from this guy down by the river. People are like, what? I'm just kidding. All right, you had a point to make on this, so I'll let you go.
So there was big news in pharma this week. Uh, Moderna company, which created the COVID vaccine seemingly
Mm.
overnight, has announced it came out with a vaccine for melanoma, for skin cancer, and it is it is novel in that there is a degree of personalization to their treatment, where every patient gets a slightly different combination of chemicals, and there is a heavy amount of compute involved in sort of calculating all that for each patient. And so the headline was that Moderna used AI to cure cancer. And if you go back and actually read their press releases, and I think they did this with Merck, they go out of their way to not call it AI, right? They call it bioinformatics, which is an older term. And I think there was a misperception that they actually used some big AI training model to do this, and that's not the case, right?
Yeah.
And I mention this because I think there are a lot of people who assume that AI is gonna come up with novel drugs, and I actually think that is gonna happen, but it hasn't happened yet, and I think that's important. Like, and you can read that as glass, a 50% glass. Is it half full or half empty? We haven't solved it, but maybe we still can. Um, and it makes me think of this company I met in when I was in China earlier this year. I went to see this company called InSilico in Shanghai, and InSilico is interesting. It's only about 5 or 6 years old, and they make a big deal about their use of AI for developing new drugs. And what they've basically done is they've taken all of their data, all the data they can, and fine-tuned some LLMs to do sort of every part of the drug processing pipeline, right? But they're not there's but even they are not using AI to come up with new drugs,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
They're enhancing the process of refining it and sort of getting it to approval stages. Um, but it's interesting. Like this is a company that is using AI very, very heavily, and they're just using it to enhance the process, right? Which is not sort of novel. The process existed. They're not coming up with new ways to find a drug, and they've done incredible things. Like they're a 5-year-old company. They have thirty drugs in their pipeline right now in development, which is a big number for a small company like that. And so, one, I think IntelliGo is very interesting, but I think it also shows the limits of what AI is able to do today, right? We're not at the point where AI is curing cancer. Um,
Yeah. I thought
and
I thought it was interesting that everybody that I follow who, I thought was uh, a technology, semiconductor investor, all of a sudden was a biopharma expert
yeah, yeah,
around
yeah,
Moderna. I was like, they're
yeah,
putting out reports. I was like, wait a minute, didn't you just write about GPUs? Like, no, but I actually, your point is valid. Obviously, people are working on how AI can be used to help cure diseases and cancer. There's optimism that that happens someday. Obviously, that will play a role, but yes, I think again we have people getting ahead of their skis, if to use the term lightly, in uh, in uh, in some framing. So, but I think that will become more of a story in pockets over the next few years about how compute simulation and running that work, that research they do, can maybe make time to trial faster or something. But yes, AI is not solving all of the world's problems yet. uh, Instead, people are still arguing about data centers showing up in their hometowns and fighting them like it's nobody's business. So sentiment on data center builds is not good.
yeah. And I think that's part of the dialogue is that AI was so heavily hyped up in its early years in 2023, and people used ChatGPT to make silly memes and then kind of thought that was it. Um, and I have to think if we start to get more meaningful advances because of AI, that will change people's tunes. But we haven't had that yet. And
Well,
I'm optimistic, right? I'm optimistic. Like again, these companies are barely scratching the surface of it. They're using Ampere and Hopper. What happens when they get orders of magnitude more compute
Yeah.
in these some of these big systems, right? And
Yeah.
and I think if you look at some of the people who are really, really leading that and very, very advanced, and they're thinking about AI, like some of the guys from Google who just left. Um, I think they think that's all possible, right? And
Oh,
those are people
sure.
who are pretty deep
Totally.
into this. So
Yeah.
I think it's possible. I don't know when.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I went to years ago when Amazon used to do this event called Remars, which was sort of just a meeting of the minds of everything to automation, robotics, AI, etc. Someone from Big Pharma, I can't remember who, but came in and basically showed like what they do to go through drug discovery today. And it was expensive, it was cumbersome. Yes, they threw a lot of compute at it, etc. But the whole point was, what happens when we can speed this up via, compute and AI and intelligent simulations grounded in real world science, etc. So that was years ago. So like it's always been talked about, but yeah. But to your point, like it's just we're in a weird moment with AI sentiment. I, I don't know how long it takes to get over that. But it's, you hear about these tensions. It's getting talked about a lot. Data center builds being stalled and whatnot because of counties getting angry. And I'm witnessing this in our backyard as Amazon's building three multiple 100 megawatt data centers. And so I'm on these like Facebook community boards and I see them sharing like notes from meetings. They're all angry. We're going to run out of water. You're going to pollute our ground. You're right next to a pepper farm. Like, anyway, it's interesting. So the joys of this moment of AI in a build out. Okay.
Yep.
Let's talk about custom ASICs. There was some news around custom ASICs. Marvell and Google have a enhanced relationship that was good for the stock, but also people again misinterpreted this news as a little bit different, I guess. There was some knock on Broadcom, which was not the case, which we'll talk about. Um, but if you read the news very clearly, it was definitely this deal is more for IP and custom work around the periphery, not necessarily the TPU itself, which is what Broadcom does and then does with MediaTek to agree in that design and other vendors. But that's not bad, right? Being in the periphery, bringing the optical. I noted very quickly. I think there has a lot to do with CXL around this and disaggregated memory. In kind of the report that we wrote a couple weeks ago about why DDR4 reuse is kind of a immediate TCO unlock. Google's got a lot of DDR4. Marvell's the best positioned in the full stack for CXL. Um, but yeah, people were like, "This is terrible for Broadcom." It's like it's not terrible for Broadcom. This is also a huge growing market in dollars for custom silicon. But Marvell's playing an important role, but it is more on XPU attach, if you will, to use a technical term.
Yeah, it was. I mean, we talked about this 4 weeks ago, where, or maybe even longer. It's clear that Broadcom has been with Google that designed TPUs from the beginning, and it's just gotten so it's Google's TPU ambitions have just grown, and the complexity of chips that they're designing has grown. Uh, and I think it's to the point now where they want to diversify. Right? I mean, it's well known that Google is uh, uncomfortable paying Broadcom's margins, but they are stuck with them for a variety of reasons, mostly around SerDes IP. But they as they expand, it's only natural that they're going to want to take on additional suppliers to help them bring all this to market. And I think there's obviously Google has a lot of its own tools itself, right? Um, they've designed their own EDA tools in a lot of cases, so they have a lot of chips they want to build. Um, so it is. I mean, I understand why it's bad for Broadcom. It is they're losing a little bit of share inside Google, but also to your point, it's growing so big. They were never going to hold on to 100% of it, not with the size that Google is, chip ambitions are. And I think you're right. I think there's an argument that like the things that Marvell will do for Google are not necessarily businesses that Broadcom wants that badly. It's not that big a loss, maybe. Maybe you could argue this is something that they couldn't do. I don't know where their state of their CXL is. So, uh, not great for Broadcom, but not the end of the world. I think they're
Yeah,
still likely to hold on to a lot of the core TPU business.
yeah. But I think you hit on the tension that I think people have pointed out kind of regularly, which is both these companies actually want diversity, right? I don't think either one wants to be beholden to each other. Yet at the same time, Broadcom's going to get a lot of wafers, right? They're going to get, in some cases, a lot more wafers than other people because of their scale. And so, you look at sure, you can do some of this with other vendors, but you still need them for a good portion of your volume. But you had this even early on, right? Broadcom. This goes back a couple years, but we've sensed the tension where people are like, "Hey, you got too much customer concentration." So okay, well, great. Yes, Google's our biggest customer, but fine. But they also want that diversity. So you kind of have those two dynamics that play into each other. Um, that makes sense, right, in terms of each one's strategy. But it's like people complained, right, for so long, particularly on Broadcom, that now that they are focusing on diversity and they have X number of bigger customers, still an obscene amount of wafers at TSMC, people think it's bad. So
In terms of relative impact, it's a small negative for Broadcom. It's a massive win for Marvell because the dock on them has
yeah,
very much been they're entirely dependent on Amazon for their custom ASIC business, and they've done a little bit to diversify, and now this is a fairly sizable step for them and de-risks them to some degree. They have a long way to go though, so it's but it's
yeah,
good. It's good now that we can, because I mean we've talked about this for like 2 years. The whole debate about Marvell was are they losing share at Amazon? How much share are they losing at Amazon? Now it's like, okay, they have more than one customer to hang their hat on.
yeah. No, I agree, and I think again, I keep coming back to it. You know, we've tried to slot Marvell cleanly into the role they play in XPUs. We have constantly sort of come back to they keep saying it's it's XPU attached, right? What does that mean on the periphery, IO tiles, networking, etc. And I just think it's becoming clearer that is the role that they play. They can again get into other parts of kind of off XPU, but still a part of the XPU um, versus on package. But thinking of them as a periphery XPU attached beneficiary is actually, I think, a good positioning for them as they continue to get more of those deals with other vendors versus the CPU tile or the ASIC tile, which is not they can do, but it's not what they are doing.
Yeah, it's weird because they have a pretty solid processor team, but they have it's pretty solid, right? But they have really sort of leading class networking. Right? Remember, they acquired Cavium, they acquired Inphi.
Yeah,
This is
yeah.
one of the leading networking chip companies out there, and that sort of got lost in the. We stopped talking about it for years, and I think they've realized they need to talk about it more, and they have a lot of opportunity there. So
Yeah,
something new
yeah,
for
I get
Marvell.
it. All right, so then now Broadcom's getting some more news because they are and I don't know if I think this is a rumor, but still reported. But looking to raise capital for some of these TPU deals. So this got some speculation, a lot of question. Why would you need to do this when you've got very big customers who also have a lot of cash? And Anyway, I'll let you go into it. We can kind of talk about what that means and why more people are doing this types of stuff, Intel included. But yeah, you start.
So I think Bloomberg broke the story. Legitimate media outlets are saying that Broadcom is raising, I think, $60 billion for a special purpose vehicle, an SPV, to do something in the data center, probably with Anthropic. And I think this is very much in line with what we saw last week with NVIDIA and their $500 billion their own SPV to fund data centers. And I think what's uh, what's clear now is uh, the chip companies are starting to use their balance sheet, just like the hyperscalers are using their balance sheet to compete. And it's important, right? I think if you think back, what was it, last year, roughly 6 9 months ago, um, NVIDIA sort of changed the nature of competition. They said we're not just competing on chips, we're not just competing on servers, we're doing rack scale system level design. And that sort of forced their competitors to follow suit. We had AMD buy ZT Systems so that they could do rack scale design. Now NVIDIA is coming along and saying we're not we're also competing with balance sheet. We're going to help fund the data center. They've been doing it for a while. They've really amped that up, and their competitors have been following suit too, right? It started with backstops on neocloud capacity, and it's expanded into something probably much bigger than that now. Uh, NVIDIA is using every tool it can. They've used a lot of the technical tools. Now they're using balance sheet as a tool to compete, and that has put pressure on AMD and now Broadcom to follow suit. Right? If you want to win business here, you can't just have the best chips. You can't just have the best systems. You need to have the best. You need to bring the balance sheet into play as well, which is very, very different for this, something very new for the semiconductor industry. Um, it is it's a little concerning, right? These are companies that historically have had very, very little debt for good reasons, and but now they have to start using these tactics in order to compete against NVIDIA. So that's uh, the as I'm talking about it, I'm getting more and more worried about it. Right? You think about it, for for 50 years, the semiconductor industry. I mean, it's like one of the things you've just known, like chip companies don't have debt, right? Because the problem with debt is that it forces you onto a schedule because you always have to repay things, right, on time, and that's hard to do. Chips are cyclical. Technology cycles come and go. You don't want to go bankrupt because you've missed a product, right? And that's what debt can sort of put you into very difficult positions, because you have to sacrifice cash flow from, say, R&D in order to make your debt payments. That's not a good look. You miss the next product cycle, and becomes puts you in a bad place. Um, Now, things obviously change. The chip companies are much larger and have much stronger cash flows, and nobody's sort of tripping into even you know into problem territory on the ratings. But it's not, there are risks here. There are risks
Yeah.
here, and right, and we were just talking about Marvell a second ago. Part of the deal with Google is that they gave them equity. They gave
Right.
them
Right.
warrants, right?
Yeah.
Right. We
Yeah.
saw AMD do
Tied
that,
to tied to revenue. Yeah. Right.
that's
Exactly.
right,
Tied to revenue and payments. Yeah.
right, and we saw AMD do something similar with OpenAI a few months ago.
Right.
Right, these companies are deploying their balance sheet, both equity and debt, in order to compete. Um, which is, I guess it's a thing to do. I guess it's better than giving them 10% off the price of the chips. But it's getting. I mean, like I read all of this as the 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 processor landscape is getting is amping up the competition. Like the competitive intensity is amping up,
Yep.
right? And so that's and Nvidia is leading the way, but they're having they have to do it. They're
Yep.
not unassailable because like it wouldn't have to raise $500 billion in debt if their technical lead was so big.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah, and but I also think like you wouldn't do some of this, and I get the risk portion, but you wouldn't do some of this if you also didn't have fair visibility and confidence from your customers that there is still some coming ramps that are uh, not necessarily guaranteed, but fairly high confidence in their capacity needs, their roadmap needs. Because again, like we talked about, like I do find this interesting, the LTA waterfalling of how much the supply chain has to then just go do more deals with every bit of supply chain further down. And that's, there's a lot of capital, right, that goes into that to make sure you can meet your commitments. So it is. I mean, I think again, right, your point is you're right. This is a new dynamic for the semiconductor industry. Um, to some degree, this is kind of, I guess, what happens when a capital intensive industry has to go and build out in a longer timeline than they're used to. Um, but it's just this whole cycle is causing different like stuff we've never seen before because of the build out. So, um, but yeah, I think people will continue to worry about it because obviously there is risk.
Yeah, and I think it's telling too that everybody doing this is structuring these as SPVs rather than putting it on
Yeah.
their own balance sheet, and that adds costs, right? If you start bringing in other players, an SPV will typically have other players involved, or private equity or some other funding institution will be involved, and they expect to get paid, and we see the hyperscalers doing this too. They're all doing it in SPVs, and I think the idea is if you put it into a remote entity like an SPV, you can keep it off the company's books, sort of. Like it's not actually going to appear in their financial statements, but buried deep beneath all these things, there are real obligations tied to them, and we
Yeah.
probably won't see those
Right.
until it's too late.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, like I said, there's a lot different, but at the same time, it, this is an industry that's, I guess, not had to do in the supply chain what they're being asked to do now to meet demand. So,
Yeah, I mean,
you
it's
know,
interesting to me. Like
this is what
I'm
it
getting
is.
calls from fixed income investors and fixed income journalists. Right? I've never talked to these people in my life. Like, all right, I've never had to like you cover tech companies. You never have to pay attention to the balance sheet, and now suddenly we've joined the fixed income party. I get to go visit the fixed income clubhouse now.
Awesome. Well, balance sheet competition. Let's keep that on our radar, and perhaps a report needs to be written about the balance sheet era of competing, not just who has supply chain scale, who's got the balance sheet and supply chain scale. Anyway, all right, everybody, a little shorter episode for you today, but looking forward to next week because I will be at Hot Chips. It is a great session. If anybody happens to be at Hot Chips, hit me up. But this is always one of my favorites to talk about and glean insights from. And then we have some earnings next week from some big names. Marvell, Nvidia, I believe, is next
Ooh,
week.
yeah, it's next week.
Yeah. Uh, yeah. So awesome times. We're looking forward to it. All right, everybody, have a good one. We will talk to you next week.
Thank you, everybody. Tell your friends.